Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Martin Dugard, and he's just published a book. You can see this on YouTube or Rockfin. Title of the book is Taking Berlin, The Bloody Race to Defeat the Third Reich. And there's a Kindle audio book and hardcover of this. And his website is his full name, Martin Dugard, last name spelled Dugard. And he is the New York Times bestselling author of several works of history. Another book in kind of similar terms to this one is Taking Paris. There's another one called Into Africa, The Epic Adventures of Stanley and Livingston. I've done a show on that. And also he has done the Killing series with Bill O'Reilly. And those have sold more than 10 million copies, so very successful. He's also a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, and he spends time coaching high school cross country and track near Southern California. And it's an avocation which he's indulged in for the last 20 years, as documented in his essay, To Be a Runner. And some of his book titles are The Murder of King Tut, The Last Voyage of Columbus, Farther Than Any Man, The Rise and Fall of Captain James Cook, Knockdown, and Surviving the Toughest Race on Earth. He's also lived on the island of Pulau Tiga during the filming of Survivor's inaugural season. I think Survivor's on almost 30 seasons now or something crazy. Survivor's inaugural season to write the best-selling Survivor with mega producer Mark Burnett. But again, we're going to talk about this book. Fascinating book. I've done a lot of shows on World War II, so I'm kind of familiar with the history. But he does a great job of kind of taking you into the whole panoramic view of really what was happening in Europe and Russia and the UK and all the personalities involved. And you can see these personalities on his book cover. And again, the title of the book is Taking Berlin, The Bloody Race to Defeat the Third Reich. So, Martin Dugard, welcome to the show.
Oh, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. So for people who may not be familiar with your name or this successful Killing book series, can you kind of talk about your background? You have a very successful writing career and what led you up to putting together this book, Taking Berlin.
I guess I'll go back to the start. I was that guy who got out of college and got a boring corporate job, and I came home every day complaining about how much I hated my job, and my wife told me to do something about it. And I began writing, just trying something that was kind of on a lark, began writing magazine articles on the side because I'd always loved to read and write. And I started kind of with local running and triathlon magazines. I worked my way up to the GQs and the Esquires and the Sports Illustrateds. And at some point, something had to give. I was doing the corporate world and writing at the same time. And then I was given a chance to travel to Madagascar to cover this 2-week adventure race. And I got back and my boss fired me on the spot, which was the best thing ever. And I came home and I told my wife that I wanted to give writing a try. It was a full-time gig. And she gave me the best advice ever. She goes, I support you, but if you're going to do this, you're all in. I don't want to see you reading the WAD ads. I don't want to see you, looking at other career paths. If you're going to do this, you've got to make it happen. And so, that was February 24th, 1994, and I've been doing this ever since. I moved, as my kids got older, it wasn't realistic to travel as much as I needed to make a career as a freelance writer. So that's when I entered the book world. And it just, I kind of transitioned away from sports and began writing about history. Well, the first one was my book about Captain Cook. And it's been history ever since. I've done a couple, I covered the Tour de France for about 10 years, but pretty much everything's history. And I think one of my trademarks is that just the full immersion into the research. I was traveling to the locations, walking the footsteps of the individuals I'm portraying in the book. And, along the way, it's just become, I think the research gets better with every book. The writing gets a little bit tighter. And, after doing 12 Killing books with Bill O'Reilly for the Killing series, which has actually sold 20 million copies now. It's done tremendously well. It's the biggest nonfiction series in the history of publishing. So it's done really well.
Amazing.
Yeah, thanks. No, it was just one of those things. But after 12 books, I kind of wanted to go back to hearing my own voice in the books, and so I did Taking Paris. And when I got to the end of Taking Paris, which ends August 26, 1944, with the Allies liberating Paris, I kind of felt like the story, there was more to say. and I needed, the war wasn't over yet. So that led to Taking Berlin. And so it kind of picks up where Taking Paris leaves off.
Right. So you start, I think the prologue is May 1544, UK. And you have, there's great details. Like I really enjoyed all the specifics of these personalities, but it starts with the King of England, Montgomery, Eisenhower, Churchill, all the big names are there at the beginning of this book for the invasion, right?
Yeah, there was a big, it was a big unveiling of the D-Day plans, and it took place at St. Paul's School in London. And interesting story, in the room they held, they'd evacuated the school. All the school children were sent to the countryside for the duration of the war, and Montgomery took it over as his personal headquarters. And so he basically had every top British and American admiral or general was in the room that day, along with Winston Churchill and the King of England. And George Patton makes this big dramatic entrance, and I really like that opening just because it gives me a chance to kind of reveal almost all the characters in one fell swoop. But also, I just like the research aspect of that. Going to St. Paul's, which still it's a hotel now in London, and the room where they actually had that meeting does not exist. It was destroyed by a Nazi bomb later in the war, which is too bad because I really wanted to be able to go into the room and see it. But at least it was nice to go, visit the hotel, get the lay of the land, and kind of smell the air, so to speak.
And you did that on the mainland too, on the continent, kind of seeing the sites that you portray in the book, correct?
Yeah, my process is pretty simple. I'll research a chapter. I'll even write the chapter ahead of time before the travels. And so when I finally get to, for instance, when I went to Arnhem, which is where I actually didn't go to Arnhem, I went to Nijmegen, which is kind of the bridge too far. If anybody saw the movie back then, it's that market garden operation. And so I knew, so that way I know what I'm looking for. I know what I need to see. And for instance, with that one, when I went to Nijmegen, there's this moment in the book where General James Gowan, the 37-year-old two-star parachute general, asks his men to paddle across the Wall River into the teeth of some really thick enemy resistance. 26 boats set out. Half of them are blown out of the water. And actually, I knew that I wanted to go to that spot just to be able to retrace their footsteps. I knew that they carried the boats up and over a thick berm before they walked down to the water. And then so I did that. I walked down to the water. I want to be able to see the water, see how fast it is, what color it is, what does it feel like to stand there? Is it sandy or is it grassy? All those little details you can insert into the book. And it's interesting because the place where they assemble the boats is now a CrossFit studio. So you kind of always get that surreal blend of the old and the new when you visit these sites.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing. So there's still all those remnants of World War II are all kind of around that part of Western Europe too, right?
Oh, it's everywhere. And you have to know where to look. I mean, when I did the book Killing Patton about 10 years ago, it opens with this battle over the city of Metz and this place called Fort Driant, where the Nazis it was actually almost subterranean, and the Nazis were able to, attack they were within this fortress. And I wanted to find the fortress, but it's not on any map, and I kind of knew where the location would be. It was kind of the same thing as going to Nijmegen. And I went to this place. I drove around. I had to trespass a little bit, and I found it. It's right now. It's in the middle of a thick woods, and I actually went into this place. I could see the old gun emplacements. I climbed on the roof of it, and it was interesting because I came back and I told a friend of mine who's a patent authority that I'd found Fort Driant and I'd done all this stuff. He said, "Oh, who is your guide?" I said, "I didn't have any guide. I did it all by myself. I found it. I was so proud of myself." And he said, there's unexploded ordnance all over that thing. So who knows what could have happened, but I came out okay.
That's good. I think they're still finding unexploded ordnance all over the place, all over there. There's just like all the remnants of war. But you don't just kind of talk about the perspective of the Allies too. You also involve Rommel and Hitler. Can you talk about the kind of Axis viewpoint of this invasion?
Yeah, it's important to balance the story. There's always a good guy and a bad guy, and then you have Rommel, who's somewhere in between, who is one of these guys who was actually encouraging Hitler to sue for peace, and he was, I'm reluctant to use the term good Nazi, but at the same time, he was having a crisis of confidence about the way the war was going, what it was going to mean for the future of Germany. So I wanted to insert that into the narrative, and once again, it's a matter of doing the research, reading the journals, traveling to the town where Rommel lived at the time. He was convalescing from an injury. In the case of Hitler, going to Berlin and walking the streets and getting a feel for what the city was like during the war, all of those things. But it's like when you write about Hitler, there's like kind of a yuck factor to it, because there's so much evil surrounding him. You have to kind of try to get into his head. And, sometimes with a character, when you like with, Patton's easy. Patton's, he's very mercurial. So he's audacious, but he's also moody and contemplative. It's easy to kind of sympathize with him and read his journals and kind of really get inside his personality. But Hitler is so dark that you can only go so far where, because then all of a sudden you let that person kind of live in your brain for a little bit. And as you're writing about them, then you have to try to let them go. But it's hard to explain. But when you write about these people, you get to know them as if they were a close friend. I mean, because you know their every action, you've read their journals, their innermost thoughts. And, if some of these people stepped in my office when I was writing, I wouldn't even be surprised at all, even though everyone's dead, just because I know them that well. So, like I'm saying, which is why I'm reluctant to let Hitler get too much of a toehold in my head when I write, even though I have to go there a little bit just to get the job done.
Yeah, like a real monster, just like holding out and fighting to the end, no suit for peace, whereas a lot of other people would have been willing to do that, including Rommel, right? He kind of saw that the writing was on the wall.
Yeah, when Rommel got hurt, he was shot by a Canadian Spitfire. He, a 20 millimeter cannon just blew his chauffeured vehicle off the road. He would have been wise just to stay in France, which is where it happened, because then the Allies would have captured him, but at least he would have had a chance to recover and live. But once he went back to Germany, we kind of set it up in the book. A spiral happens as he and Hitler kind of have a showdown over the future of the war. And his son, Manfred, who I found to be a very sweet character as I researched the thing, him and Rommel had these long discussions about, what it means to be at war. Manfred was only 15. He had just been conscripted in the army, and he and Rommel were having these long discussions about, Germany's fate and what it is to be at war, what the post-war world is going to look like, which I found very profound.
And that was actually a discussion among everybody, right? So everybody in this huge event knew that there was something happening now, but there was going to be something totally different once the war ended, right? So everybody had that on their mind, right?
Yeah. So the war, began, September 1st, 1939 with the German invasion of Poland, but it really began in May 1940 when the Germans went on the offensive again and invaded France. The British declared war, and that was kind of the start of it. But from that period, May 10th, 1940, all the way up till D-Day, which is 4 years later, the big focus had been gaining a toehold in Europe, getting a large Allied force onto the European continent. We had people in Italy, but it really wasn't quite the same because there was still a long way to go to get to Germany. But so the D-Day invasion was really super important as far as just getting people onto the continent. But once we did that, once we had that toehold, and once we were starting to advance through the Low Countries and we retook Paris, all of a sudden the focus shifted to two things. First of all, fighting Japan, because that was the thing. People were starting to already make plans about how to get all the Allied troops over to Japan for that battle, but also what the shape of the post-war world was going to look like. All of a sudden you had the Russians. They had been, of course, invaded by the Germans. They had fought back, pushed the Germans back. They were also racing to Berlin from the east, and they did. The Russians and Churchill had discussions about, which countries were going to be allowed to be communists at the end of the war. They're kind of carving up Europe. It was really just one of those things that it just kind of took shape during those last 9 months of the war. But what's interesting about it is pretty much everything that's happened in the world since 1945 to today was kind of set up in those last 9 months of the war. You have the Soviet Empire, you have even the stuff going on in Ukraine right now is straight out of Joseph Stalin's playbook. And so, I even make the case that modern feminism got its start during World War II, and especially this last year of the war. And in the book, we have the character Martha Gellhorn, who was Ernest Hemingway's third wife, but a really fascinating character in her own right. And in her independence and her way of getting around the war zone without journalistic credentials, just surviving on her wits. It's such a great example of a strong, independent woman.
Right. So you have that kind of female, but there also is this whole there's the Bagration, Operation Bagration, and Stalin moving. So they're in communication, right? Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. Can you kind of talk about kind of the rivalries among the politicians and the generals?
It was kind of weird, So if we could focus first on you mentioned Operation Bagration, the D-Day landings, the invasion of Normandy by the Allies on June 6, 1944, was an operation on a massive scale. Just one of the most epic things that had ever taken place in the history of warfare, particularly the naval portion of the invasion. Having said that, Operation Bagration, which was the Soviet response to D-Day invasion, which was basically them saying, okay, you're going to attack from the west. Now we're going to do our part and attack Berlin from the east. And Operation Bagration it dwarfed D-Day in scope, and we hear very little about it in the West, but Operation Bagration was one of the most colossal, massive. I mean, it was just, in terms of men and material, in the length of the front, it was just on a phenomenal scale. And after that took place, that really kind of began the dash to Berlin. Everyone wanted to knock off Hitler. But then that's where the geopolitics came into view. You had, Stalin was very cryptic. He was, whenever they had a meeting together, like when they were at Yalta, it was Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. He had every room, which it took place in Russia, so the Soviet Union. So basically, he had every room bugged, so he knew everything that was going on in all the conversations with his allies. Churchill knew that Britain was on the way out because because Great Britain they were just impoverished. They were losing all their colonies. They were not going to be a post-war global player, even though Churchill was trying very hard to make sure that they still were relevant. And then you had Roosevelt, who had fantastic political instincts, but for some reason he totally trusted Stalin at a time when Stalin was the last person in the world he should have trusted. So a lot going on there. And that was one set of relationships. The other set of relationships, of course, with the generals, in particular, the battle between Patton and Montgomery, which I found fascinating because, Montgomery is this uptight, bird-like, very methodical individual. And then you have Patton, who's, all passion and romance and, very aggressive, all blood and guts. And they could not have been more opposite in their styles of leadership, but actually the two men were very, very similar, which I think kind of led to some of the how it is when people are a little bit too close in personality. That's where you kind of get those the clash of will, so to speak.
Right, but they all wanted credit to get in, right? Patton was always chomping at the bit, and Montgomery had his own, and Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander, right? So
right.
He's overlooking all these characters and working with Churchill. But can you kind of talk about the march from D-Day, the Omaha beaches?
Oh, sure.
All the way kind of through Paris up to kind of the Rhine.
Yeah, kind of, going back to what you said, if you look at all the three characters, Eisenhower was the man in charge, but he was, he was like the store manager, he was in charge. He was the politician. He made sure everybody got to do their part. But then especially with Patton and Montgomery, you had two men who had trained their whole lives to be military leaders, and they both knew that there was never going to be another opportunity in their lifetimes to wage war on this epic scale and to direct men, and frankly to get the glory for the successful things like like taking the city of Berlin, kept in and putting an end to Hitler's reign. So you look at a map, from D-Day onward. So Montgomery stayed to the north. He went, north up through France into Belgium and Holland, and that was kind of his part. And he was planning on going to Berlin from that route. Patton was further to the south, so Patton from Normandy kind of stayed in the southern part of France. And he was the one who directed the path towards Paris. He actually wanted to bypass Paris because once you get into Paris, you have this moral obligation to, feed and use oil for heating for all the local population, and which would have been a terrible drain on U.S. military resources. But in the end, he decided that was the right thing to do. So you have Montgomery in the north, you have Patton in the south, and then Eisenhower had to manage these two people. Patton wanted more and more gas. He wanted more and more ammunition because he just wanted to go. Whereas Montgomery wanted everything to be given to him because he thought he was the one who should lead the path into Berlin, particularly because he was British, and the British had suffered so much in the war before the Americans had even come to take part. It was almost 2 years of war before the Americans were even on the stage. So a lot going on there. And in the end, and this is the frustrating thing is, because as the story unfolds, you kind of think that one of them is going to win, and you forget about the Soviets on the east doing the exact same thing, and they're just as eager to be the first people into Berlin. And then that sets up all the conflict that comes when Eisenhower is forced to stop the Americans, to stop the British, and allow the Russians to go in and take the city, if only for the sake of politics. And in that way, it did help shape the post-war world and the advance of communism.
Right. I mean, Germany was split. There's East Germany now under the control of the Russians. I mean, it really is incredible. But there was intense fighting on the Western Front, but the Eastern Front was ferocious too, right? I mean, it was like
you got to remember. I mean, it all went back to when the Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and they were trying to, they're trying to go to Moscow, do what Napoleon couldn't do and capture Moscow and take control of the Soviet Union. And of course, they were halted. They were pushed back by the Soviets after some bitter fighting. And when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, they were rapacious. They killed everybody in sight. They raped women. They did horrible things to the prisoners of war. It was just brutal, scorched earth battle, and it was just one of those things where the Nazi army was seen as being so great that it was like there's nothing that could stop them. So they just took great liberties. Well, when the Soviets pushed back and it was their turn to be in charge, they proved to be even more ruthless than the Nazi Germany, and the way, and their revenge on the Germans was just horrific in the way that the things they did to the German people, the way they just raped and pillaged and looted. It was it was almost like a warfare going back to the Celtic tribes or the Germanic tribes, in where if you survived, it was only out of sheer luck because everybody was dead. Everybody was killed. It was terrible.
Yeah, and the Eastern Front, like the whole nation states lines and national lines were totally changed. Germany's lines, whereas on the West, it seemed to be more stagnant, but all the land changed. Poland grew. I mean, even there's still kind of issues today, just like you said, they're still kind of fighting about the issues and the lines that were drawn post World War II. But yeah, so that was some of the most brutal fighting, the revenge. And even Bagration, you mentioned Bagration was the guy who resisted Napoleon. So World War II was also seen as like another repeat of that invasion, right? Napoleon's march on Moscow.
It's interesting. Part of my research, there's nothing about it in the book, but went to Budapest, and they have a great military museum there. And part of the museum is dedicated to the men of Hungary, the men from their army who were conquered, who basically, Germany had control. When the Soviets came in, all the men that had fought on the Nazi side were taken prisoner, and they just disappeared. And that's what happened to a lot of the German prisoners too. And even there's talk about, Allied prisoners who fought on the same side as the Soviets. They all went into the Soviet gulags. They disappeared into Siberia, and they never came back, even though they were, when the war ended, they should have been released. But the Soviets just made sure that it was like they followed the same scorched earth policy with everybody.
Right. Just a massive move of men and material and things like that all the way to Berlin. I mean, can you talk about the decision making of the Allies and what led to allowing this? I mean, it was a big idea for kind of the UK and the US to allow Stalin into Berlin, right?
Yeah, what happened when they sat down at Yalta, they decided what the post-war shape of the world would look like, and what part of Germany would be controlled by America, what part of Germany would be controlled by Great Britain, what part would be controlled by the Soviet Union. And at some point, Eisenhower realized that it would probably cost about 100,000 Allied lives to fight their way into Berlin. But knowing that at the end of the war, per that treaty, they all had to pull back out and go back to their own zones of occupation. So the order came down from Eisenhower, I think it was March 1945, basically telling Patton and telling Montgomery, sit tight, you're not going to go any further. And Patton was so we let the Soviets waltz into Berlin. We were going to do this massive parachute drop on Berlin. It was going to be fantastic. It was going to be the last great parachute drop in history. And General James Gavin was going to lead it. That got canceled. And so we allowed the Soviets to go in. And Patton was the only one who said, the Soviets aren't going to back out at the end of the war. They're going to take as much as they can. So Patton did not stop. He kept going as far as he could. He went into Czechoslovakia before he was told quite firmly by Eisenhower to stand down and not fight anymore. And like I said, Patton was ready to go to war with the Soviets right there, and that would have been a great book. Let's put it that way.
Would have been interesting.
I'd write that book.
I think he was one of the arch or primary people saying that they were going to be the next danger, right? Like we were going to go right to war with them. Is that correct? Can you say something?
Yeah,
like that?
Patton was in favor of taking all those Nazi troops and those Nazi generals who had proven so efficient at waging war, and then basically letting them loose on the Soviets, and we would fight right alongside them. And all in all, not obviously a controversial idea, but not entirely a bad idea given what has happened since.
Right, the Cold War and all the responses on that. And can you kind of talk about the decision? Some people may not have seen that movie, A Bridge Too Far, but there was a pretty bold decision to paratroop a lot of troops past German lines into, you mentioned Nijmegen and some of these other places. Can you talk about Operation Market Garden and what was successful and what wasn't?
Operation Market Garden was, it was conceived by Montgomery, and the whole idea was that, again, remember Montgomery's in the north, he's up in Belgium and Holland. His whole idea was to make use of the massive paratroop divisions that the U.S. and the British had. And the road from the Belgian border into Germany is a line, it's just basically a narrow country road. And because that's it's a very low-lying area, there are a series of bridges from, in the 65 miles between the Belgian border and the German border. And his plan was to drop paratroopers in. They were going to take control of those bridges, and then the British Army would follow the road, kind of connect the dots, bridge to bridge to bridge, and rescue the paratroopers and take control of the land. And then basically, at the end of it, he would cross that final bridge into Germany, and we would have a toehold in Germany. And the thinking there was that the Germans would completely capitulate, which we later found out with the Battle of the Bulge was never going to happen. But it would have came out to be, they had all these bridges, but it turns out to be exactly what the movie was called, A Bridge Too Far. Now, there was just, they got all the way to Nijmegen, and 10 miles after that was the city of Arnhem with the final bridge into Germany. And when when everybody got all the way to Nijmegen, there was just such stiff German resistance that the 10,000 British and Polish paratroopers who had jumped into Arnhem were almost completely slaughtered. By the end of the battle, they were down to 2,500 men. So that's 7,500 men who perished, and they weren't taken prisoner. They just found their way out. They floated down the river in the dead of night to get away. But it's one of those great battles that could have been averted, because I learned in my research that the Dutch Military Academy was doing a study on what is the best way to get from Belgium to Holland Belgium to Germany, through Holland. And they said, the one road that you should not use is the one that Montgomery chose to use. And the thing is, Montgomery never consulted with the Dutch about how to do it. And it might have turned out quite differently if he had listened to him.
Interesting. And I think you wrote that the Germans found somebody inadvertently took the Market Garden plan on one of their gliders, left it in there, and the Germans had it, so they knew what the plan was going to be, right? How it was going to play out.
It was just one of those dumb things that happens in wartime. Somebody didn't think it would be a big deal to take the plans with them, or maybe they forgot they had them. But when the person's glider crashed, the Germans found the plans, and they knew exactly what we're going to do and where we are going. So it's the thing about it is, history sees Market Garden as a debacle of sorts. I mean, because it failed, but it wasn't a complete failure. It was just one of those battles that just wasn't executed or thought of properly. In other words, it took a year to plan D-Day. Market Garden was planned in a week, and it was just so hastily put together that it really didn't do all it was supposed to do.
Right, and that's Gavin. One of the guys who led it is in between Stalin and Patton on your book cover, right? So he kind of earned some fame for his heroics. But then there was, they were thinking, I mean, you wrote in your book, they were thinking the war was going to be over by Christmas. They were hoping for a Christmas end. That did not turn out to be the case. Can you kind of talk about the Battle of the Bulge and kind of the resistance on the west side, the Western Front?
Yeah, again, we kind of thought it was, the time of year where everybody was going to be kind of shutting down. It was cold. It was really cold. It was a very hard winter, and everybody was thinking about Christmas and getting home, and the Germans, it looked like they were just going to roll over. And Hitler had his own kind of crazy peace plan, was that he was going to drive a wedge between Patton's people in the south and Montgomery's people in the north, and he was going to drive it all the way to the sea, all the way to Rotterdam and Antwerp, and basically have this corridor right between the Americans and the British. And once he maintained that, then he was going to ask for peace talks. He was going to ask if there was a way that the whole thing could be resolved without Hitler getting arrested, or I don't know how he was going to pull that one off. But it was a surprise attack, and we weren't prepared for it at all. We weren't, we didn't have the right clothing. We weren't alerted to it. A lot of the area that through which Hitler chose to attack was very close to the area through which they attacked to open the war in May 1940. And we, even despite what had happened to the French, we still thought that was someplace that they could never attack through. So we had all these units who'd been pulled off the line to rest and recover and retrain, who were spending basically a down period there. And all of a sudden, these people are, all of a sudden the German army just comes thundering through in just, an artillery barrage, and then the Panzer tanks come through, infantry comes through. And for a while there, it was really looking like it was going to turn out badly. A series of blunders by the Germans kind of shot themselves in the foot, so to speak. But it was, which allowed us to win the battle. But it was Patton pivoting his Third Army to, they were still supposed to be attacking into Germany. He turned them sharp left, went right into Bastogne, it defeated the Germans, something that logistically was not supposed to be able to happen, to take an entire army and move it so quickly. But within 2 days, he pivoted his entire army to stop the Germans. So there's so much drama to the Battle of the Bulge. It's one of those things that this is why I did the book a little bit differently. You look at Bagration, you look at D-Day, you look at Market Garden, you look at Battle of the Bulge. All of those huge battles are books unto themselves. And instead of writing just about the battles, I wrote about the battles, but I write about them through the eyes of General James Gavin, George S. Patton, even Winston Churchill from his point, and even Martha Gellhorn, because she was on the front lines too. So if I think it helps to understand the battles better if it's more of a you are there, like you're with these people, you're in the thick of the fight, you know what's going on, and hopefully it keeps people turning the pages. This is not a dry history book. It's meant to be a very exciting history book. I think that history is as exciting as any great piece of fiction. But again, I'd rather people, instead of just focusing on troop movements and the scale of the armor attack or this and that, that's all there. But I want people to see it through the eyes of the people who are there. I want them to feel the bitter cold. I want them to feel the mud and the snow and even the whine of the bullets. All those things go into making you feel like you're in the war zone.
Yeah, your descriptive power, great details. It felt like a cinematic read, like you were in some active kind of battle movie in a lot of ways. So I commend you for that. We're at the 36-minute mark. Martin, do you have time for a few questions?
Sure.
One is, do you know Patton? Patton, you wrote a book, Killing Patton. Was there some suspicious things around his final days? Like some people have said that was an assassination because he was trouble. There was a car crash and then he died in hospital. What's your take, or what are your thoughts on his untimely demise?
I wouldn't be surprised if Patton was assassinated. The Soviets were well known to use vehicles, the car, a fake car crash is a means of murder because it looks much more normal than shooting somebody in the head or poisoning somebody. But that's what happened to Patton. All of a sudden, he was actually supposed to go back to the United States. The war was over. He was supposed to go back the next day, and a car pulls, a big military vehicle pulls into the road and slams into his car. His neck is snapped. He's taken to a local facility where he waits. His wife comes to see him, and it looks like he's going to be paralyzed, but he's going to go home. And then, seriously, he dies in that 24 hours before he can leave Germany. And, as an aside, we talked about the research. When I did Killing Patton, I went to the U.S. military base which was where his hospital room was. And I went in to I saw the room. It was kind of cool. I saw the facility. And it was great because I only learned later that was the last day that the Americans had control of that base, since they'd had control since World War II. The next day, it reverted back to the Germans. So it was nice to be able to go to see the place where Patton actually took his last breath.
Fascinating. Do you know any story about him and the Spear of Destiny? Have you ever heard the whole story of the Spear of Longinus and that Hitler wanted it? And Patton, did you?
No. I mean, it's out there. The thing about it is, when you research stuff, I mean, it's pretty specific to what I'm writing about, and some of the tangential stuff, like Hitler's belief in reincarnation, that plays a role. But it's not a biography of Patton. So
did Patton think he was reincarnated? I remember that he thought he was like a Greek warrior in some past.
Oh yeah, he thought he'd had several lives. That's why when he was in North Africa, and it's the opening scene of the movie Patton, where he goes to the battlefield in Carthage, and he says, I've been here before. He truly believed that.
Interesting. Fascinating. And what are your thoughts on Hitler's final days in the bunker? Do you think he got out, faked, or committed suicide? Do you find that correct?
No, Eva Braun, Eva Braun got shot herself, or Hitler took arsenic and then shot himself. They took his body up top. They burned the body with the dental records to show it. I mean, everybody likes to believe that Hitler survived, but actually took a lot of gasoline to burn the body, which was the thing I found most fascinating about it. And if you go to Germany now, the place where the bunker used to be, it's right next to this lovely monument to the Holocaust, but it's just basically a parking lot. The Soviets leveled it during their occupation there, so you can go there. And you kind of hope you're going to see like some remnant of it, but really it's just there's a sign that says this is where the bunker used to be located. And that's it.
And I think he died. That's kind of like a Viking's death, right? Don't the Viking bodies get burnt on some boat or something? So he kind of emulated Viking death. I don't
You
know.
know why they burned the body? Well, Hitler took great pains to paint, the Nazi Germany is some great descendants of the Vikings, which was just, complete malarkey. But the reason they burned his body wasn't because of a Viking death. They were afraid that if the Russians got his body, they would make a show of it. They would mutilate the body. They would parade it through the streets. Hitler couldn't imagine that as his final end. So he would rather have his body burned so that it didn't fall into the wrong hands.
Fascinating. Michael says that he read Patton's diary 3 times.
Yeah.
You talk to each other. Great discussion. Thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Where's the best place for people to get Taking Berlin? I know there's a lot more in the book.
I think, the bookstores everywhere. Amazon is the easiest. You just one click. Shouldn't, everybody, all the online bookstores, but Amazon is the one that has it. Barnes and Noble, every place but Costco. For some reason, Costco didn't pick it up this time. But it did. Taking Paris did great at Costco, but Berlin's not there right now. Too many big books at Christmas. So
I feel like I saw one of your Killing books at Costco recently too. So I don't know.
Oh, they're there. Killing books kind of get an end cap, which is great. So I'm hoping for end caps with Taking Berlin. So we'll see.
Gotcha. And there is a Kindle and audiobook, so people can order the audiobook off of Amazon.
Yeah.
And where's the best place for you? I know you have a website. Can you mention your website? How can people contact you if they're interested?
Sure. Let me go back real quick to the audiobook. The audiobook for people who read audiobooks or listen to audiobooks is great because the actor who reads the book is a Shakespearean actor. He was actually a character in the Harry Potter movies. So he's got this great stage voice. So I really love that he's doing the reading.
Is that Samuel Rukin?
Yeah, very good, very very good. It's nice to, when you write your words, you want. When I write something, I actually print it out. I read it out loud to make sure it sounds good. But the way that when I read it, and the way that he reads it are two different things. He makes it sound very poetic. But my website is martindugard.com, MartinDugard. I'm on Twitter at Martin J. Dugard, and I'm also on Facebook as author Martin Dugard.
Gotcha. So there's many places you can reach out. This book was just published, right? November 1st, 2022.
Just came out a couple weeks ago, yeah. So awesome. Right now I'm working on Taking London, which is the 3rd book in the series. We're going back to the Battle of Britain. Fun research on that. I was in London a few months ago, and I got to actually fly in a Spitfire. So some of the most fun research I've ever had in my life. That was really cool.
Wow, that's cool, man. You're living it. So you've gone through all these sites so people can see the first place what he saw depicted in this book. Martin Dugard, thank you so much for your time. And the title of the book is Taking Berlin, The Bloody Race to Defeat the Third Reich by Martin Dugard, just published November 2022. Thanks so much for your time.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It was great. Thank you.
Take care. Stay there.
Right.